Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this second session of the CJP 25th anniversary celebration. We're here with Sujatha Baliga. Welcome, Sujatha. I will just briefly read her bio, and when I am done, Sujatha, you can just take over. We're so glad to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sujatha Baliga's work is characterized by an equal dedication to survivors and people who've caused harm, grounded in her belief that all of us have been both at some point in our lives. A former victim advocate and public defender, Sujatha was awarded a Soros Justice Fellowship in 2008, which she used to launch a pre-charge restorative youth diversion program in Oakland, California. In her most recent position as the director of the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice, Sujatha helped communities across the nation implement restorative justice alternatives to youth incarceration. She's also dedicated to ending child sexual abuse and intimate partner violence through restorative approaches. She speaks publicly and inside prisons about her own experience as a survivor of child sexual abuse and her path to forgiveness. Sujatha earned her AB from Harvard and Radcliffe Colleges, her JD from the University of Pennsylvania, and has held 2 federal district court clerkships. Her personal and research interests include survivor-led movements, restorative justice potential impact on racial disparities in our justice system, and Buddhist notions of conflict transformation. A 2019 MacArthur Fellow, she is currently working on her first book about forgiveness of seemingly unforgivable harms. Sujatha's faith journey undergirds her justice work. A longtime Buddhist practitioner, she's a lay member of the Gyuto. I forgot to ask her how to pronounce this word. I hope I didn't butcher it, Sujatha. Gyuto Foundation, a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Richmond, California, where she leads meditation on Monday nights. She makes her home in Berkeley, California, with her partner of 24 years, Jason, their 15-year-old child, Satya, and their rescue puppy, Mala. All right. Did I mispronounce that, Sujatha?
Yoto, that's right.
All right. Wonderful. Well, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. And I just feel incredibly blessed to be invited to be a part of this conversation today and this celebration. So thanks to the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding for this invitation and for this warm welcome and the kindness of including me and my voice in your beautiful journey. So, and also thanks to all who are listening in under these less than ideal circumstances. It had so been my hope that this would be another one of those wonderful times together in person in the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains, where we're all sitting around until late at night, having those heart connections and those mind meld conversations that we have. I was really hoping that the postponement of 1 year would mean that we would be doing all of that in person, in the breaks and the intercessions over meals, really deepening our understanding and our love for one another. But unfortunately, we are still Zooming our way through life for the time being, hopefully for not too much longer. But it's still, you know, there's still a possibility for those kinds of heart connections and for those ideas to percolate together, to celebrate, reflect, dream together, which I think is just such a beautiful theme for what it is that a 25th +1 anniversary is really about. So, so I hope that those of you who are watching will have time and chance to reflect today and throughout the days and weeks that follow in collective ways in some way to be able to do that, to have those conversations and to be together. So I opened today with a request for understanding and for those of you who pray or are inclined to send positive thoughts to someone. As many of you know, our beloved Ashley George of Impact Justice is in a battle for her life. She's at Stanford Medical Center awaiting lung transplantation. And so that may be terrible news for some of you to hear. We have all the faith in the whole universe that if there's someone who can pull through the situation that Ashley's in right now, it is our indefatigable Ashley George. But it's both a request that we hold her in our hearts and in our prayers, if that is your thing, but also to offer me a little bit of grace, because I am not as well prepared as I might have been for something as momentous as a 25th anniversary, an invitation to speak at such an event, because my whole heart has been consumed and most of my waking hours with thinking about Ashley's well-being and her medical care, and the Restorative Justice Project team, who's obviously really holding so much. So I left my position at Impact Justice in July, but my whole heart is still there, obviously, and my connections. As Ashley says, she once said, what are the 3 R's of restorative justice? And we're all sitting there scratching her. And I was like, responsibility, respect, what? And she said, relationship, relationship, relationship. And so so we're still holding each other quite close through this really challenging time, and Ashley's family and the whole community of care around her. So with that, understand that my emotional state is a bit tearful at times, and my preparation is not all that it could be. And I will be speaking more from the heart than from the head, which is probably a good thing for me, as I'm still trying to recover from my years of practice as an attorney. So anyway, I really appreciate the grace that you offer me today, and your prayers. And I'm going to drop a note into the chat right now. So I'm going to drop a note into the chat right now, where I'm going to give you a link to something that is keeping us up to speed about how Ashley's doing, for those of you who are close with her, those of you just want to follow along in her journey. There's a Padlet that her family's put up, and you can do that. Oh, and I'm realizing now that it would also be really good to know where everyone is, and you know, where you are in the world at this time. And so yeah, so you're so welcome to put that into the chat so I can see a little bit about how and where you are, and a word maybe also about sort of what is your mental state at this moment. I know I've kind of just thrown a pretty big thing out there, but if people would want to put into the chat and make sure that it's to everyone so that we can all see it, it would be really wonderful to know who's in the room, and where you are in the world, and what your state of mind is right now. That would be a really wonderful thing for me to know. And so as someone who has, oh, thank you. I think there's a little bit of a lag, so I'm starting to see. Thank you, everyone. So as someone who's gotten to spend quite a bit of time with Indigenous people across the world, I've been taught to first share who I am before speaking. And I really love this practice because it reminds me to whom and what I owe my ideas and my experiences and my flourishing. And I also appreciate that it gives you context for what it is that you'll hear from me. As a Buddhist, I think objectivity is a fiction. And I love that our growing learnings from the field of quantum mechanics is really backing that up. And so I share this sort of as a way of offering also as a sort of footnotes in advance. And in many of my past iterations and in my work, both in academic context and also in legal context, when I share too much of myself or I share a bit about myself, I've often heard people sort of, or I can feel a sense of, oh, she's biased. You know, she thinks this because of her life experiences. Whereas I think that the real heart that we ought to bring to this is more of a, oh, she knows these things because of her life experiences. And so I love that my ideas are shaped by myriad causes and conditions, and that my thoughts will reach your ears and heart and mind and eyes, and that those are also shaped by myriad causes and conditions, and some of which are similar to mine, and some of which are incredibly different from mine. And I hope that there will be some beneficial alchemy in that experience. So a bit about me. I am the daughter of Mohandas Baliga and Sarala Shenoy. And while my grandparents were independence activists, hence my father being named after Gandhiji, Mohandas, my nuclear family ultimately found ourselves in rural, politically and socially conservative South Central Pennsylvania in the 1970s and 80s, just a few hours up the road from EMU off of I-81. And so during those years, I experienced a great deal of social exclusion and bullying during my childhood as the only child of color in my school and as the only non-Christians in the town for most of my childhood. And what invitations into relationships and friendships I did receive often required my agreement to convert to Christianity, which I did not oblige. And so that was really formative for me. And also I was blessed to spend formative years in various parts of South India, growing up around family as a child. So all of this was complex, and our relationship in India was also fraught. So my people were colonized by both the British and, until 1961, by the Portuguese, who brutally occupied the lands of the Konkani people long after the British rule of India ended. And so something that is always really troubling for me when I am in India and I'm meeting Western travelers, I would often hear people say things like, oh, I need a break from India. I'm gonna go to Goa for a little while. And what that says about the lands that my people inhabited pre-colonization was that the colonization was complete, right? That when you say I need a break from the culture of a place, I'm going to go to this part of the same country, it is because the Portuguese colonization of Goa was quite complete. And so, so that is also very complex. And so while I've lived at the nexus of those and many other sources of oppression, I also have to acknowledge that as a Gaud Saraswat Brahmin Konkani, my family lineage has also benefited from unearned caste privilege. And so do I to this day. In a sense, that part of my journey has some similarities to those of you who are working as white people to end white supremacy, both within yourselves and the world you inhabit. And so all of these varied legacies and more live in me. So the Gaud Saraswat Konkani Brahmins apparently originally hail from the Himalaya, from the valleys amongst the tallest mountaintops in the world. And from there, for reasons unknown to me, we were displaced to the area of India that's now known as Bihar, where there were very harsh living conditions, which then again drove us to Goa, and the Konkan coast is what it's called. So unpacking all of this requires that I learn more about my people and our history, which is no small task for someone who for many years has been estranged from most of my kin and was also forced in rural Pennsylvania to stop speaking my first language in elementary school. But of late, I've begun to learn many things, some problematic and others ancient and others sort of inspiring. As members of the priestly caste, my ancestors were keepers of ancient and secret teachings, some of which could only be handed down through disciplic succession. And the secret part is problematic on a number of fronts. There are quite a few casteist aspects to that. There's also a gender element to who received those teachings and who did not. And those teachings were ultimately completely lost to my family lineage through colonialism. And as my uncle said with regard to these teachings a few years ago, there are no more qualified students nor qualified masters in our tradition. But he did also tell me just before he passed in his late 90s that a version of these teachings were kept alive by Tibetan Buddhist masters and were ultimately taught to others regardless of caste. He's like, I knew you'd like that, he said. So that was a sweet moment of engagement we had the last time I saw him. So those teachings did, maybe in their most essential and important aspects, they did survive. When he said this, this revelation really took my breath away. Because during the years of my separation from my family, I had, unbeknownst to them, converted to Tibetan Buddhism and been raised Hindu. And so I came to Buddhism desperate to make sense of my life. My father had passed away just a few years earlier, and I was left sorting through the aftermath of having been raised by a man from whom I both inherited my leftist politics and my sense my unending sense of obligation to upend the infinite suffering I saw in the world, but also with the aftermath of decades of his abuse, including sexual abuse. So, who would have thought that ultimately, by taking refuge after he passed away, by becoming a Buddhist, I'd ultimately be returned to a path that led me to some of the very teachings that my uncle was speaking of, ones that had been lost to my family and simultaneously cleansed of their casteism. And by my seeking out Buddhism, I found myself journeying over and over again to the Himalayas to learn from His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and other amazing Tibetan masters there. And when in the 1960s, the Portuguese were finally driven from India, a massive tract of land on the Konkan coast was gifted to Tibetan monk refugees, where my husband and I would later be taking my son to visit one of our teachers at that monastery that has 10, 15,000 monks. And so here I was returned to the Himalaya, to those mountains, and to the actual physical land of my people in this incredibly circuitous journey. So one of the teachings that I'm studying now, one of the religious teachings I'm studying now, more closely specifically relates to accountability and repair and redemption after one has caused harm. And it's a teaching that I was starting to get interested in years ago and started to dig into actually because of a blog post that Howard Zare put up. And it was about shame, and he and I started a little dialogue in the sort of comment section of his blog on shame. Since then, I've really been wanting to make the time to better understand this teaching. It's called the Four Opponent Powers, that are about helping us come through the harms that we've caused without falling prey to shame and to believing that complete and total redemption. The word they use is purification, which is loaded in English. It doesn't have quite a perfect translation, but it's a beautiful practice, and it's one that feels really beautifully like coming home in so many ways. So I share this circuitous journey with a wish that every person listening in today, in some way, we all find our way to something that feels like home, feels just and righteous, and that gives us a sense of meaning and belonging. So by choosing to be a public survivor of sexual violence, I've often been relegated to the outer bounds of the places that should have felt like home to me. And in the end, though, I've learned that sharing who I am and what I've come through has had countless benefits. And while that road has been definitely challenging at times, I've learned that sharing who I am really has produced incredible, wonderful heart connections to so many survivors the world over. I meet them after I've given a talk at a fancy law school. I meet them when I'm speaking inside a prison. I meet them everywhere. And so this has been an incredible blessing and new kind of kinship that is forged of something quite unfortunate, but in the end is true and good. And so I've made it my practice to name that I speak to you as someone journeying to transcend not just cultural displacement and racial violence and so many other terrible things, but also specific harms of childhood sexual abuse by my father, campus sexual assault, rape in my early 20s, and that transcendence is a real blessing and one that I feel incredibly privileged to be able to share with you all. So it's also important to name that I come humbly as someone who has caused harm in my life, both from leveraging my place in the structural oppressions that at times benefit me, and as someone who has caused more direct and even at times intentional harm to others. I think it's important to name that because I'm often held up as the survivor leader. And I think that asking us to draw a line down the middle of society where there's people we call victims and people we call offenders, which I don't prefer that language at all, that all of us are people who have both caused and experienced harm. And I am surely one of them. It feels necessary for me to tell you that because ultimately I am seeking to engage in and be the recipient of unconditional love. And if that is true, then sharing how we have erred is a really important part of being able to accept the totality of one another. And so it's my hope, in particular, these types of communities, that we can start to name that more directly. So I want to also say that I come to you as someone who deeply loves people who have caused unthinkable harms, including the types of harms that were done to me in my childhood. And that I have people in my life who I love and respect, who have caused these exact types of harm. And I think that that's a part of the journey as well. So I learned also many invaluable lessons from my years as a victim advocate, and both in rape crisis and in domestic violence contexts, as well as from my years as a public defender, and especially also finally from these past 15 or so years immersed in the world of restorative justice. I've had countless teachers along the way. I'm sure many of you are listening in now, but I'm going to just name 3 because they've been connected to EMU in some way, whether as guests or as faculty: Howard Zare, Justice Robert Yazzie, and the incomparable Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz. My life and work have been immeasurably enriched by all 3 of them. And so I offer to them and to all of my other teachers a really deep bow of love and respect. I also want to name 2 of my other teachers, my child Satya and my partner Jason, who teach me every time we have a circle in our family, every time we just sit down for a meal together, every time we go for a hike, every time we battle through a homework assignment. Or remember to read our wedding vows to each other. Again, I learned so much from both of them. And so that is a part of who I am and what I bring. I wouldn't be who I am without them today. And as well as my sister and my mother, both of whom have been just integral parts of my survivor journey and my journey to becoming who it is that I am today. So more than anything else, I come as someone who's profoundly grateful to the Tibetan masters who've kept the teachings of the Buddha alive when they were lost to my homeland, and to the people who've taught me about restorative justice, whether through the various indigenous ceremonies that I have been able to be a part of, or through the earnest Mennonite seekings for covenant justice, and all the other ways that all of us come to restorative justice. So as a restorative justice practitioner who's learned much from Indigenous people, I'd like to take a moment of silence now, of intention setting, around my obligation to work towards justice for Indigenous people. And this is more than just naming the land of the Muwekma Ohlone people my home occupies back in the Bay Area, or the Karnasi and Munsee Lenape land that I speak to you from today. But to my mind, it's more about the myriad ways that many of us, many of us, are obligated to repair countless harms done through settler colonialism. And even as I say these words, I can hear Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's admonition to not reduce people to a single story of genocide, land theft, and cultural appropriation. So I'm going to ask us to take a moment to hold in our hearts gratitude for the brilliantly nuanced and life-giving teachings that have been also freely given by thriving Indigenous people the world over, especially those of us who are involved in justice, peace building, and restorative justice. Really, the gratitude is immeasurable. And I'd also like us to just take a moment to, if we can, remember where it is that we all come from, to the degree to which it's possible to know, acknowledging that it's a privilege to be able to do this, and that only some of us have this privilege. I'd like to take a moment to be grateful and aware of the complex histories that led us into this room together today, into this Zoom room, acknowledging how those myriad causes and conditions give rise to lenses on our eyes and ears and hearts and minds. And I'd invite you to do this for a minute with me now. You're going to hear a bell at the end of about 90 seconds, which for those of you who are not meditators will feel like an eternity, but I promise the bell is coming in 90 seconds. And And so if we could just take a moment to contemplate in the things that I shared there at the end, which part of it feels resonant to you, and just to sit with that for a few moments in silence. Thank you for giving me that time and for joining me in that moment. So I really have been cherishing this theme, celebrate, reflect, dream. It's been really wonderful to spend a little bit of time thinking through those three words in relationship to the topic that I chose about whether we're climbing the same mountain and what journeying to collective liberation might look like. And so I wanted to start with celebrate. And so actually I got on my very first plane yesterday since the beginning of the pandemic, since February of 2020. And as someone who used to travel multiple times a month, this was quite a shock to the system to be back on a plane again. And I'm here to celebrate my best friends. I'm in New York, getting ready to celebrate my best friend's 50th birthday. And I too am turning 50 this summer. And so as CJP turns 25 plus one, and I'm turning 50, and my marriage is just turned 20 last year. I'm really personally grateful for the opportunity to consider these words: celebration, reflection, dreaming. So for me as a Buddhist, the celebrating birthdays thing is kind of funny because we think of, we call it a precious human rebirth, and there's an urgency in the sense of how short our lives are. We consider this a very brief and precious time we have in this particular incarnation. As it says in the sutras, this is quoting from the sutras, this is the Buddha speaking. He says, "Bhikshus, imagine a great land, this great land becoming a vast ocean, upon which there floats a yoke with a single opening, cast about by the wind. In that ocean is a blind turtle. If that turtle were to stick out its neck once every 100 years, bhikshus, what do you think? Is it easy for that turtle to enter the hole of that yoke floating in the vast ocean?" "No, Bhagavan, it is not," they said. To that, the Bhagavan replied, "In just this way, bhikshus, a human life is difficult to obtain." So in the Tibetan version of this, the yoke, it's not just a yoke floating on an infinite ocean. That yoke is actually made out of gold. And that golden yoke is really a beautiful image in many regards. And one, just the impossibility of something golden floating on the surface of an ocean. But they're not just talking about a human rebirth. They talk about what's a precious human rebirth. It's not just to be born human, but to be born human with a whole list of other wonderful conditions in our lives, including, and maybe most importantly, having manifested at a time in which the teachings were accessible. And so this idea of a golden yoke is very beautiful. The golden part is that this is quite rare and precious and not to be wasted, this opportunity. And the yoke is actually something that, it's interesting that it's a yoke, right? It's like a thing that binds. It is something that holds us to something. And so the word dharma actually is, dharma means to hold. And it's that which holds us back from suffering, that which holds. And so this beautiful golden thing that holds us back from suffering, to be the turtle that arises once every 100 years, the blind turtle that arises once every 100 years and pops one's head through this thing. This is quite precious. And in many ways, I feel that way about my own life and this incredibly circuitous route to restorative justice that I took. Like, what were the chances, given all of the things that I have lived through and been through, that this would become my path? It feels very precious and magically impossible in a sense. And I think many of you might feel the same way. And I think that way very much so also about the Center for Justice and Peace Building. What are all the incredible causes and conditions that gave rise to it? So while on the one hand, celebration of the passage of time often feels counterintuitive to me, there's so much that I would like to do in this particular incarnation. And as I age, time seems to be flying by faster and faster. And we all have maybe 100 years at most. But there really is something incredible to celebrate here, right? The improbability of all of these causes and conditions coming together, that we would have these things in common, that we would have things to study and share and learn together, is just a beautiful, beautiful thing. And unlike human lives, we don't know the lifespan of an institution, right? Some last quite a long time, thousands of years even. So for a moment, I'd like for us to take some time to have this wish, really, for the long, long life of the Center for Justice and Peace Building. And things that last a really long time have to adapt, right? And so I've seen some adaptation in just the few years that I've been connected with the center. And so it's my wish that CJP continues to grow and thrive and adapt and adjust and be relevant and beneficial for a very long time. And so what I would love to ask folks to do for a moment is to go back and look at, hang on, I'm scanning some of your beautiful comments for just one moment before I keep going. Oh, really nice to see dear friends, old and new, and your names here in the chat. So what I'd like for you to do now is list some things that you're celebrating about CJP. Maybe you've done this earlier today. I'm sorry that I missed the opening session, but I would love to see some more of them and for us to just come back to those things. So when I think about the things that I am celebrating right now about CJP, I'm thinking about all of those wonderful summers at the Summer Peace Building Institute. And I'm thinking about all the things I've learned from the Zaire Center webinars. And I'm thinking about the palavers I've attended and the fires I've sat around and had amazing conversations at in Harrisonburg. And so if people wouldn't mind putting some things, what you've learned or known or grown from, for those of you who have had, for those of you who are, this is not your first connection to Center for Justice and Peace Building, please feel free to share a few things that are coming to mind for you. Indeed. Connections and friendships with beautiful people from around the world. Absolutely. Friendships, mentors, colleagues, so wonderful. Beautiful comments coming in. Students who are teachers and who co-create amazing learning experiences with faculty and their peers. Such beautiful comments. Thank you all so much. Keep them coming. Feel free to keep looking at those. So that's, part of the reflection part of the talk. And now I want to move into reflect. And reflection has been challenging, but good and necessary in these past few months and over the past few years in thinking about reflection. On the wake of so much political turmoil the world over, and for some of us, the wool has been pulled away from our eyes. But for others, the privilege to have wool over one's eyes was never really a reality. But in the midst of these past few years, things have been really laid bare with regard to injustice and violence and rampant inequities, too long a list to name. And I found myself in countless meetings about what to do about it. And I often leave with some of those meetings with a question about whether we're climbing the same mountain. And so that is the topic of this talk and what it was that I wanted to sort of spend some time reflecting on today. Are we climbing the same mountain? Some of us, it seems, are talking about liberation, and specifically the liberation of all beings, everyone, or at least all people, some of us all beings, some of us all people, while others seem more focused on expeditiously reducing the amount of suffering that people are experiencing in real time, right? And others still are more invested, it seems, in institutions as they currently exist and tweaking them. And so there's sort of this continuum, and some people are like totally fine with the way everything is today, right? And so this is quite a broad group of, and there are many, many buckets along that continuum, right? But let's say on the folks who acknowledge that things are not the way they ought to be, there's sort of this reform versus revolution sort of approach to thinking about things. And this feels related to me in some ways to sort of two theoretical camps that we hear about in restorative justice, whether or not restorative justice is a paradigm shift or an approach to reforming our current systems. And so I myself am of the view, or that there are many views, right? That it is that it's a good system that needs to be tinkered with, or it's fundamentally flawed and incapable of reform. And so I myself, with regard to the criminal legal system, of the belief that the system is irreparably damaged at its roots, at its very roots, the ground that it stands on. And for me, it was the plain text of the 13th Amendment that convinced me that the system itself is born of slavery, right? And that plain text of the 13th Amendment, for those who haven't read it, says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And so to my mind, the history in this nation, it extends not just around prisons and the production of the labor of people who are incarcerated, but also extends to policing as well, which was created as slave patrols in the South and to put down labor organizing in the North. And so for these reasons, I have found myself arriving at being in favor of abolition of the entire prison industrial complex, including parole, probation, surveillance, policing, et cetera, all of it. And I've been called to this beautiful process of, which we get to at the end of the talk, dreaming a new world, dreaming a different way of being, dreaming alternatives. And so I did not come by any of this directly. And that is interesting to me. I did not come to abolition directly. I didn't like hear about prison abolition and go, oh yeah, we should do that. Even though as a child, I knew that I never wanted my father to be incarcerated. I never wanted immigration consequences for my family. I never wanted to be taken away through Child Protective Services. I had no interest in those approaches for my own family. Even as a victim advocate, I saw systems failing survivors. Even when I was a public defender, I saw the system railroading my client into unfair and inaccurate plea deals that were going to derail their entire future and any possibility of turning their lives around, right? I still didn't quite get it. But it was, what's really interesting is that, you know, while some people have been very clear on abolition from jump, for me, it was actually restorative justice that brought me very squarely to prison abolition. And where that comes from really was my falling in love with Howard Zer's 3 questions, right? So the paradigm shift that he calls us to is asking, rather than asking what law was broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished, we ask who was harmed, and what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? And so as a survivor, when I first heard those questions, it like made my heart sing. I was like, wait, nobody's ever asked me, how was I harmed? We can't even talk about that. What did I need? I surely didn't need my father in a cage, and I need to be taken away from my family, right? And whose obligation? Well, gosh, I don't think it's really the state's obligation to do anything. Or, you know, it's about my father. It's about my family. It's about my community of care. And some parts are about me and my own healing journey and my obligations to myself. And so, you know, these were just life-changing questions for me. And when I first learned of these, I think I was doing capital work at the time when I really started thinking about it. And I couldn't see how we might answer those questions in a court of law or through any kind of legal proceeding. And so every part of the legal process seemed to corrupt the beauty and simplicity of those three questions. Like every single way of trying to interface with the criminal legal system as it currently operates really compromised the questions in a way that felt utterly unsatisfactory to me. So, and then in all my years of practice, I left the practice of law and I started to try to help communities build restorative justice alternatives to youth criminalization. And in all those years of practice, I found that so many problems did indeed arise when restorative justice was operating too closely with or embedded in the current criminal legal system. And so this cognitive dissonance that I was feeling between RJ, what it is, and what we had to do to it to make it align with the system's requirements, it just kept growing and growing and growing. So in the early days of trying to build the work of the Restorative Justice Project, my former boss and dear friend Alex used to hear me in these early battles with systems partners and just loving battles. I would just say over and over, but what you're suggesting isn't restorative justice. And that's, okay, I see what you're trying to do there, but that's not restorative justice. That's not restorative justice. I said it so often that Alex used to joke and say, this is Sujatha, she runs our That's Not Restorative Justice Project. And people have joked that I should write a book by that title, but I think obviously that'd be kind of arrogant. I know that no one made me the arbiter of what is and isn't restorative justice. And yet there are many stories I could tell that would fit nicely in a That's Not Restorative Justice book. In particular, I can't count the number of times survivors have asked for restorative justice in lieu of the criminal legal system, but that request has been denied by people who work within the system. And the reasons, if we're not just getting silence in response to the request, the reasons are pretty much always the same. It's either the crime is too severe, or the people are deemed unworthy, i.e. they had prior convictions, or let's try this partial version as long as the state maintains complete control. Basically, it's you can do your thing, but then we'll decide whether that's going to be the outcome. Or you can do your thing as long as you do it in our particular way. And it started making me say, well, if you make us do that, that's not restorative justice. And there's different emphases on those words. If you make us do that, that's not restorative justice. So it sort of raises this question of what adaptations ruin its spirit, what it really is. And then there's another way of thinking about that sense as if you make us do that, that's not restorative justice. Sort of what external power and control over the process that takes away survivor and community power and empowerment make it not what it really is. And so these are some of the things that when people are throwing out other ideas, I'm often thinking we are not climbing the same mountain here. And I want to stay in relationship. You know, I want to continue to imagine, but on the other hand, sometimes we have to just say we're just not climbing the same mountain here. So, and I'm always inspired by the generosity of Howard Zer's continuum of restorative practices. You know, there's this whole continuum for less restorative, for non-restorative to, you know, fully restorative, and there are many good things that could be happening along the way of that continuum. But I tend to try to hang out on the more restorative end or the fully restorative end of that continuum as much as possible. And sort of this definition that I've been playing with over the years about how we might land on that more restorative end of the continuum. And that work is really to the degree possible and desired by the parties. face-to-face dialogue and participatory decision-making in which those who've caused harm are lovingly held directly accountable by friends and family to the self-identified needs of the people that they've harmed. And those processes are also excavating and remedying the root causes of what landed us here in the first place. So if that's just completely impossible, then I generally don't get involved. When people are pitching ideas and I'm like, it's just not lining up at all with this, I don't get involved. And also, if a court or a judge or probation officer or anyone else that's not directly involved in the harm can veto a collectively created outcome by those most directly impacted, then I'm also deeply disinclined to get involved. And because that's not my mountaintop, that's not even in my mountain range, really. And so I really want to honor where other folks are in their journeys. And at the same time, I feel like it's really important for us to stop and ask, like, what's your mountain? What's your mountaintop? Where are you headed? And so that would be the next sort of set of questions, as well as what is, not just what's your mountaintop, but is the course of action you're taking really going to get you to the top of your mountain? And I've had some painful experiences of being asked to really rigorously examine my own, my moral compass, my methodologies, my strategies, my plans, and whether or not they really do align with where I say I want to be going. And so, it's no small amount of work to understand whether our work gets us to the top of the mountains. We've chosen, I feel incredibly blessed that over the past 12 years, mostly working with an organization called Impact Justice, and many of the same people, even before Impact Justice, I've worked with who've helped me get clear on whether I was even on the mountain I claimed to be on, and whether our approaches were helping us make any headway. And so during those past 2 years, my work's been in two major areas: helping communities create diversion programs for young people who've caused serious harm, and working with adults experiencing or causing intimate partner and sexual violence. And so while I did recently leave Impact Justice last year in July, about a year ago, I remain an advisor and really believe wholeheartedly in the dream team that's leading that work today. Really brilliant people who have everything they need to keep climbing that mountain. Really just thinking about them and also sending love to them. And I know that they're all really hurting and missing Ashley. But I also know that they're working really hard to keep climbing that mountain that Ashley and the whole team is super clear about. It's a collective liberation mountain. And so, yeah, until she's well enough to return to us in relationship in whatever way she does, I know the team is working really hard to keep climbing that mountain. And so just holding them in my heart. So I want to talk a little bit about their work and about being really practical about implementation and expansion of this liberatory vision of what it takes. And so that work is really about diversion for young people, but the hope is to continue to expand it upwards in age, and really working closely with communities across the nation to build diversion programs that make sense for their communities. And so sort of the basic criteria that it's pre-charge and it's felony level harms, in which young people have an opportunity to meet face-to-face with the person they harmed, with family and community on both sides, where there's acknowledgement of the harm and a plan to repair that harm, co-created with the crime survivor's self-identified needs, everyone involved, and to the degree possible, looking at systemic harms as well that have impacted this young person and how the situation arose. And when that plan is completed, no charges are ever filed. Rather, it is family and community support that supports this young person to complete a plan. And so this circumvents the criminal legal system as best as we've been able to figure out how to do it. And there's always a memorandum of understanding with the district attorney's office in the jurisdictions that we work in, such that they work in, still talk as if I'm in Impact Justice, such that nothing that's said in restorative processes can be used against someone in a court of law if the process breaks down. And so one of the things that's been really powerful about the work of Impact Justice is the work that they've done around data collection, which we were at first extremely reticent to be involved in. but I'm really glad that we did, and we found things like, and especially because the government isn't held to evidence-based funding in order to get their evidence-based practices in order to get their funding. I think it's important to name, but restorative justice has compared in one study to criminalizing young people for the exact same kinds of harms, resulted in a 44% reduction in recidivism. In a study in San Francisco, we saw that young people who participated, even more striking data, young people who participated in restorative justice had a 13% recidivism rate, while as the young people who were charged with crimes for the exact same kinds of crimes. That was a randomized control trial. It resulted in a 53% recidivism rate for kids who are charged with crimes. Victim satisfaction hovers around 91%, people expressing the highest levels of satisfaction. And so interestingly, again, there you can't do a comparative analysis on survivor satisfaction because the government does not keep track of whether or not survivors are satisfied. And again, raises this question of what mountain are we climbing, right? Are we really talking about the well-being and the satisfaction, the healing of all people if we're not even keeping track of what it is how satisfying it is? Rather, there's an assumption that their own standards of what qualifies as success, conviction, incarceration, collecting its own fees and fines equals crime survivor satisfaction. And again, speaking personally, that is not true of me, and studies are now showing it's not true of most survivors, particularly survivors of color. What I love most about what Impact Justice is doing is the way in which their work is not a franchising model, but rather is working deeply with pre-existing community-based organizations like Soul Sisters Leadership Collective in Miami, or the Rise Center in Richmond, California, and so many other really amazing organizations across the nation who are looking to do it, Miami style and Richmond style and whatever it is. And so you can learn more about that from rjdtoolkit.org. I'll put that in the chat, rjdtoolkit.org. Where you can learn so much more about all the elements of the model and all the hard work that that team has done. Oops, I think I did not put that in the right place. Hang on one second. To all attendees, there we go. You can learn a lot more about the work there, and really the time that was spent to figure out what would be the elements that are required in order to live into a liberation model, really is a part of the work that was done there. On the front of my work continues sort of since leaving Impact Justice on sort of 2 or 3 fronts, but the primary one in the restorative justice arena is thinking about intimate partner violence and sexual harm in the adult context, working with a group locally in the Bay Area of domestic violence organizations and sexual assault organizations and others who have come to see that the criminal legal response has not met survivor needs, particularly undocumented survivors, survivors of color, queer survivors, death survivors. So we've been working together and for the past several years, come up with something called the Collective Healing and Transformation Project. Really folding in the wisdom of domestic violence advocates around safety planning. While the movement clearly was thoroughly aligned with or the more mainstream aspects rather of the movement were thoroughly aligned with criminalization as the approach to addressing intimate partner and sexual violence. There are many who are stepping away from that. And but we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's some good things we learned about safety planning, and there's so many aspects of things like the power and control wheel or cycles of violence that we want to bring that wisdom and knowledge into our work with restorative justice. And so that's been an incredibly powerful and beneficial journey. So I want to leave lots of time for question and answer. I've got a couple more thoughts that I'd really love to share here. Some thoughts on what it means to get lost when we're climbing our mountain. And I think of co-optation, the potential for co-optation as being a huge part of wandering around the mountain a little bit confused, more towards the bottom of it instead of actually making any headway towards the top. And so a text that I rely on deeply and regularly is Howard Zer's seminal text from 1985 called Retributive Justice, Restorative Justice. And Howard asks some incredibly brilliant questions in that essay. And he's said some really, he just saw the future so clearly in some of the things. I want to read you a little bit of it now. He said, most criminal justice reforms of the past century have not done what was intended. All too often they have been perverted, co-opted, coming to serve ends different from those intended. They have not brought about substantial improvements in the process of justice. The system of justice seems to be so impregnated with self-interest, so adaptive, that it takes any new idea, molds it, changes it until it suits the system's own purposes. And so he describes at length VORP, as it was called back then, Victim Offender Reconciliation Program. In describing that, he goes on to say, should something like this be attempted at the societal level, or is it something that belongs primarily within the church? And what about the politics of paradigm change? Make no mistake, the criminal justice industry is big business, shot through with all kinds of self-interest, and will not be changed easily. And so that was 1985, and I can attest to the fact that that has been very much the case. It is very, very challenging. And so when the question is asked, what does it mean for it to be implemented at the societal level? To my mind, does that mean at the level of the state? To me, the answer is an unequivocal no. I'm not saying that there's no role for the state, but rather that the production of it, the facilitation of it, to my mind, can never be the state. I think it is responsible for funding what it has proven to not do well itself, right? The criminal legal system, by its own stated goals, was supposed to serve four purposes: general and specific deterrence, which we know it's failed at; reform and rehabilitation, again, we know for recidivism rates this is untrue; incapacitation, we can say that incapacitation only works to the degree to which you don't consider that harm occurs inside prison. And so we're simply relocating people, harm to within the confines of the state. And then retribution is the final goal, which I think it does a stellar job at, but not to me a moral good. So, so what should the state be doing? It would be great, to my mind, if it funded things. It should support two things, right? Underlying causes and conditions that have given rise to offending behavior. The state is really good at things like libraries and roads, and could do universal health care and universal basic income and all the other things that would help us reduce the causes and conditions that give rise to people causing harm. It could get really good at schools, for example, and different kinds of schools that meets the needs of different kinds of communities and different kinds of learners. And the other thing it could do is fund restorative justice programs. So then the question becomes, can the state fund restorative justice and then mind its own business and not put too many parameters, again, playing that same role of you can do it, but only this way. And so all of this makes me think about Audre Lorde asking us to what we're beholden and to what metrics we're judged by. So in her piece titled "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," she asks, what does it mean when the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruits of that same patriarchy? So I've switched out a couple words to ask, what does it mean when the tools of a racist criminal legal system are used to examine the fruits of that same criminal legal system? And Audre Lorde answers, it means that only the most narrow parameters of change are possible and allowable. And so those of us who've suffered under the current system of justice, both survivors and people who've caused harm, and those of us who fit squarely in both of those categories, want more than the most narrow parameters of change in this abject failure in the way we're currently addressing violence and harm in our communities and in the world. So this brings me to the very end of what it is that I wanted to talk about with regard to mountaintops, and that's dreaming, right? And so here I return to Howard's words from his piece, Retributive Justice, Restorative Justice, and he asks, can such a model actually work? We know from VORP that it can work, that it does work in many cases with certain types of crime, but are there limits? Where are they? It is our responsibility to find out. That is our challenge. Will VORP just be another alternative program? An alternative that becomes institutionalized, ossified, co-opted until it is just another program and perhaps not an alternative at all? Or will VORP be a means of exploring, communicating, embodying an alternative vision? Will it demonstrate that there is another way? Could it even be the beginning of a quiet revolution? That is, at least in part, up to us. For me, that is an exciting dream, but it is also an awesome responsibility. And so to help me figure out how to engage with this awesome responsibility of dreaming and this, the awesome dreaming and responsibility, I love asking myself the question, what does it mean to let go of the master's tools to climb that mountain? So when I left the practice of law and I left the practice of victim advocacy in its more traditional forms, I first learned to put down the master's tools. But then the state does loom large. I found myself for some time beating my head against the wall, trying to ask the master to dismantle his own house with indigenous and Mennonite people's tools, and that was an ineffective strategy. So I stood sort of at the beginning of a new place where I'm spending a lot of time looking to my own religious and cultural past, looking to Buddhist teachings on their incredible ancient texts, actually, on things like we should never have solitary confinement. That is in texts from 1,000 years ago. There are all these other amazing things that exist in my own faith and cultural lineage that I want to look into. Where might there be some lessons there? I'm very excited about that. And I would close with just asking us to do a little visualizing about mountain climbing. And I'd ask you to visualize this with me. We're standing in the Himalaya. There's a wonderful place, actually in Nepal, where you can stand sort of at this snow pass where you can see many, many, almost countless mountains that are over 20,000 feet high. And there are many mountains, and they're all beautiful mountains, and there are different people climbing different mountains. And the mountain that I am on is one about collective liberation, and you're all with me. Maybe some of you on other mountains, and that is wonderful and perfectly fine, and we can yodel to one another. And everyone has really come here to walk up this mountain together because they recognize that we are bound together in our efforts towards collective liberation, that none of us are free until all of us are free. And we're all headed towards the same goal, liberation of all beings, or all people. And we're holding them all with equal compassion in our hearts. And we're looking over at other paths, and their paths are different. They're all going to the top. Some of them are going up and down in different ways. And sometimes we cross paths, and I'm waving to the Christians over there doing their liberation theology. And I'm, and some people are, they're people of all faiths, they're people of no faith at all, that are sort of coming to this as social justice activists, people accompanying others through the process of dying with dignity. Some people are working to end COVID. Some people are working to end structural oppression. There are, people who are simply motivated by the beautiful practicalities of collective liberation and flourishing. And where we meet on those paths, we stop and we compare notes, and we enjoy each other's wisdom and knowledge. And we are still also very, very clear about our own paths. And even if we're walking literally on the same path for some time, when we part, there's no consternation. There's no second guessing our own paths. There's just gratitude for all the collective wisdom. There's deep knowledge and confidence that we're all going to meet at the top of that mountain. We know there's no good purpose of jumping from one path to another and just going around the middle of the mountain all day. We know that all the paths have their up and down, and we learn from one another without trying to be one another. So there's no problems of appropriation, and we just keep ascending and offering each other support and love and wisdom and care as we make it all the way up to the top of the mountain. So with that, my goodness, I've talked way too long. I will happily take questions.
I'll just thank you. Thank you so much, Sujatha. I will just remind people to submit your questions through the Q&A dialog box, because if you submit them through the chat, we might lose track of them. But keep chatting with each other using chat, but with the Q&A dialog box is open as we climb the mountain together. So we have a first question. Sujatha. It is from Deanna and Katie Mansfield and Amy Noor, who are watching together. And they ask, how would you speak to the needs for silence and stillness amidst pushes and real needs for urgency and action?
Thank you for this beautiful question and warm hellos to all of you. So one of my favorite things is something called Venn diagrams, V-E-N-T. So they are diagrams that, I'm gonna not get this exactly right, but the idea is you draw a Venn diagram, and the two things on either side of the Venn diagram have equally true and contradictory things. And the work is to learn to sit in the middle, something that in Buddhism some people call comfortable with uncertainty, or the razor's edge, which is a kind of jarring image, but it's this idea of learning to do the dance in the middle of these two things. I think it's something that one of my favorite ones is the urgency of now in one side of that Venn diagram, and on the other side is the patience of 1,000 years. And I think that this is something, I tell the story a lot. One time I was with Justice Yazzie at the Navajo Nation, the first time I ever went to Diné country. And I was infuriated by what I was seeing in terms of just like land theft, all of it, and what resources were left to people who are the rightful owners of this land, if they don't even believe in ownership, but all of that, right? And so I asked him, I was like, how are you so optimistic given all of this that has been done to your people and where we are in the world? And he paused for a minute, for a long moment, and he nodded and he said, I am optimistic about what it's going to look like in 1,000 years. And that was really, and so this is also the person that if you spend any time with Justice Robert Yazzie, he is in constant motion. He is fighting for the liberation of his people 24/7. He is never not working, right? And so to my mind, it is holding those two truths, right? That the patience of 1,000 years doesn't mean that we're not also operating with a sense of we've got to do it now. On a practical level, for me, how I do it, particularly in the silence thing, is that I try as much as is possible to wake up. I know this is going to sound a little extreme, and I wake up at like 4:30 or 5 in the morning, and I get in a significant amount of prayer and meditation and practice, and then I go back to bed. So I do it when the house is absolutely silent, and then I can wake up with my kid and get on with my day, and then all the hustle and bustle and everything happens. It's really hard. It's hard. I think another thing that can be done is really like do what I did in this talk. Like I made you all be quiet for 90 seconds, right? Like there are law professors who have the mindful minute. Jonathan Simon at Berkeley Law School makes his class meditate for a minute. I love it. What does it mean to do that? I really love listening to Erica Huggins speak. If you've ever heard her speak, you can see she's not in any rush. She is gonna take her time telling her story and engaging us at that pace. That's not my natural energy, so I'm not so good at that. But these problems have been here from time immemorial, and I know that for me, if I'm not attending to my own peace and shanti and well-being, I'm never gonna be bringing my best gifts for the very, very brief time, the very millisecond of time that I am a part of this collective journey. My nephew is getting a PhD in astrophysics, and that really helps me remember how absolutely insignificant I am. So it's really important to take that time to be the best me, for me and for others. And I just give myself that time. And I think that's really important. So.
We have another question. And the person is asking, what place does restorative justice have for survivors who want the person who harmed them to go through the legal process? How can restorative justice accommodate their desire for legal consequences for their harm doers?
A beautiful question. So to my mind, I think we have to acknowledge that survivors have a myriad of responses to harm, One of the things that is true of the current state of affairs in our nation is that there's the survivors for decades and decades have been told that justice means the criminalization of the person who's caused them harm. So, so when you've been told that the thing that will validate your experience is the system, and that is the only thing that will validate your system, then you're going to ask for the one thing that's available, right? So in my personal experience, when I sit down with survivors and I ask them, you know, how are you harmed and what do you need and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? When I spend enough time with survivors, really asking them what they need, the story often changes. From in the beginning, people really may want the only thing that has been on offer. As Danielle Sarah talks about, people are walking across a desert and there's a hamburger truck and that's the only food that's available. You can't say, you know, that everyone eating there, that everybody's eating there lined up at the hamburgers because it's the best hamburger truck in the desert, or that's what everybody wants. Like, as a vegetarian, I myself would be lined up at that hamburger truck, right? So that's what we've offered survivors. And I think we have to start there, right? I think it's really important to ask, is this what people want, or is this what everyone's been told is the only thing? Okay, now let's say that there are some people, and I don't want to be patronizing. I know that other survivors have very different views than I do. And some people may want that, right? So the question becomes, to my mind, where on Howard's continuum of restorative practices the practice arises. So, right, so like a post-incarceration or a during incarceration dialogue might be something a survivor might be interested in, not as a way of resolving the situation, right? Not as a way of coming up with the outcome, but rather as a way to have a face-to-face dialogue. It doesn't result in participatory decision-making that results in the outcome of the case, but it can meet some of survivors' needs, right? In addition, survivors may want to just have healing circles and dialogue and be involved in community processes that could, through different collective and community processes, be something that that results in beautiful outcomes that end up changing the circumstances that give rise to the harm, right? And so that might be some other things. I think we need to be creative and open. Whether or not I would call some of those things really fully restorative is a separate question, but I do think that we have to be really respectful of where survivors are in their journey and to not try to push them in any direction, right? And take folks where they are. But I also think it's important, like for me as someone who people reach out to me and they say, I want this, I want that. When people say in the end, no, what I really, really want is to prosecute that person. I say, listen, there's a victim advocate at the district attorney's office who would be better at accompanying you than I am. If these two things don't really go together, so you might need to just actually be talking to these other folks. And no judgment, no, you know, people are going to do what they're going to do. And I try to keep my mind really open to, you know, there are a lot of mountains out there and I'm just doing the one I'm doing. So.
You have some comments there of people saying we are, you know, a lot in appreciation here. So this is good. I am curious. I just want to highlight that you are using the phrase criminal legal system as opposed to criminal justice system. Would you mind expounding why you choose one and not the other?
Yeah, well, we don't really, we don't call it the civil justice system, right? And I think that it's like falsely, it's like congratulating the system, congratulating itself for the outcome of justice, whether or not they actually achieve it. Okay. And I don't think that they ever do. So that, to my mind, it is a legal system. It is a legal system. Some people call it the criminal punishment system, which I think is really interesting. But I don't say that because I don't think it always succeeds at that either. So it is a legal system. It is not necessarily the night that the system acquitted, George Zimmerman, I was kind of all done with calling it anything other than the criminal legal system. It is a legal system, and it does what it does. So for me, it's not. I don't want to ask for what I don't think it very often ever does. So that's my orientation.
Thank you. We have another question from Kara Beck, and I encourage others, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A dialog box. Kara asks, what have been your successes or strategies to respond to system concerns about what happens if young people are not successful in pre-charge RJ diversion?
This is a really important question, Kara or Kara, I'm not sure how you pronounce your name, but there you go. Yeah, the really, really important question. So this is the, so in my dream world, we would be doing everything entirely external to the criminal legal system. The reason that, you know, for some time I was involved with, and Impact Justice is still doing this wonderful work of when a child is charged, the district attorney not charged, when a child is, you know, apprehended by the system in whatever way for a harm, and the case ends up in the hands of the district attorney's office, the DA chooses pre-charge, without charging the young person, to send the case to a community-based organization that facilitates the harm. Now, that community-based organization is going to do its best to help the young person participate in the process in a way that results in the case being completed satisfactorily. If it doesn't, the district attorney still has the case and can do whatever it was going to do. What is really, really important if you're operating in tandem with the state in this way is to not become an investigator for the system, right? And so that's why these memorandum of understanding are so critical, and why having a clear understanding with the district attorney that you are not going to tell them anything that happened, and that you are not, even when you hand back the case, you can't like say why or what, you know, you just like, you have to have really, so we created a set of like codes where you can share back the information with the DA's office without saying this case is not amenable for restorative justice, and you're not explaining why. Not saying because we can't find the kid, or the kid refuses to participate, or, you know, whatever, the kid won't take responsibility. You're not going to tell them any of that stuff, because all of that is stuff that the DA can use against the young person, right? And so when all of that is made clear in advance, and that there has to be a real trust with the system's partners that you're going to be returning, and that you return as few cases as possible, because you've done everything that you possibly can to make the process amenable for people to participate in, if that makes sense. So that is, that's the way we go about it. You know, I think that there's, to me, that outcome is disappointing, right? To my mind, the criminal legal system is rarely, if ever, going to do anything that's actually beneficial, especially if the young person has been challenging to get into a restorative process. The system is not going to help, is probably going to exacerbate all the underlying reasons why it wasn't working so well with RJ. And then I wish we had more time. What our hope is that people will be really, really flexible, that partnering DA's offices will be really flexible with how long it takes to get a young person fully ready to be accountable, understanding that that timeline also needs to be driven by the needs of the person who's experienced the harm. You don't want to keep a survivor waiting too long. So that is really important too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Catherine Bargan also has a question. And she says, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, your heart, wisdom, Sujatha. I'm struggling lately with interfacing with people who have been harmed by an organization. And in the process of holding that organization accountable, the anger and frustration is being directed at me or us as the facilitators of the process. I trust that your deep spiritual practice helps you through this, which I admire and aspire to. Any thoughts of dealing with anger directed at practitioners in the moment when folks are feeling frustrated and unsatisfied?
Oh, what a beautiful question. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, I mean, really, it's about well, two things. One is one of the practices that I learned in this wonderful program. I spent a year in this leadership institute called the Rockwood Leadership Institute. And in one of the practices that they teach us is to ask what is true about what people are mad at us about. That's really hard. And to be extremely kind and loving towards ourselves, like to say like, well, what if this is actually true? Like, what if it's my fault? What are the ways in which I've contributed to this, right? That sort of thing. So that's really hard. That wasn't a nice place to start. I like to start soft and then say the hard thing and then follow it up with the gentle thing. But that is one of the practices, is to just try to keep my mind open to what is not meeting these folks' needs in this practice. What do I need to do to make accountability something that they feel lovingly welcomed into? If it's the folks who are, sometimes it's the people who are we're trying to hold them accountable. They're the ones that are really mad at us. And sometimes it's the people who experience the harm that are really mad at us as facilitators. And so I'm always like, what am I doing that's actually not meeting their needs? What I want them to walk away from is at least feeling satisfied with the way in which the thing was facilitated. And so there might be something there. And I know that you're a very gifted and wonderful person. And so that's, but there are many times when I'm like, oh yeah, really, that was me being a little too heavy-handed on the accountability before I built a proper relationship with them. Or oh, that was me sort of pushing a survivor a little bit too hard when they weren't ready. And so that now they're mad at me. I think, yeah, the other thing is just like daily meditation and prayer and like whatever we can build, whatever method that you have for not taking it personally without letting myself off the hook. So that's that Venn diagram. On the one hand, I might be doing stuff that might be causing people to not be comfortable with the process. And on the other hand, there are infinite causes and conditions that gave rise to this person's rage. I might remind them of someone. I might be, right? There's so many things that might be going on with them that have nothing to do with me, right? And so that to me is really just compassion practice. Like, ooh, something is going on with this person. And I am open to seeing what part is me. And I am also very curious. I have a curious heart about what is going on with this person. Not a curious mind, not like, oh, let me dissect you. Let me put you in my little petri dish and try to like pathologize you or, but rather my heart wants to know what it is that is pissing you off so much about me and the way I'm showing up in the world. And then sometimes you're just the wrong person for the case, right? Some people are like, I cannot deal with Sujatha and her energy. I would never want her facilitating my dialogue. That's fair. I can take that. And so sometimes you're just not the right person. So that's okay. That's okay.
We have one final question, and then after you answer it, then maybe you can close us out in some way, and then we'll tell people what the next event is. The last question is from Dave Douglas. He says, thank you for your clear and inspiring stories and thoughts. One of my trauma teachers, Dan Brown in Boston, practices Mahamudra tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. How close is that tradition to the one that preserved your cultural teachings?
Oh, what a beautiful question. Thanks. Well, so Mahamudra is, I don't know if I think of it as a tradition as much as a practice. So there are two different, in Tibetan Buddhism, the two sort of ways in which we, this is like a really wonky Buddhist question. Sorry, folks, for like, this is probably not relatable to a lot of people listening in, but I'm going to answer the question anyway. So two different ways in which we work with the mind itself as the object of meditation, right? So you can use the breath as an object of meditation, and you can use different things, you have visualization, deity visualizations, all these different things as the object of meditation. And in Mahamudra and Dzogchen are two different ways in which you use the mind itself. You learn to isolate the nature of the mind. So the mind itself as the object of meditation. And Mahamudra is one of those approaches. So there are many different lineages, but it's the Gelug Kagyu are two of the traditions. There are four schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and Gelug and Kagyu are two of those four. And Gelug Kagyu is a type of, are the two schools that are very deep in Mahamudra tradition. I myself landed in Gelugpa land, and within that there's a particular way of thinking. Prasangikya Madhyamaka is a philosophy within the Gelug world, and that is where I landed. And there are incredible similarities, and also a set of practices that are sort of unrelated to Mahamudra. But Mahamudra is more of it's a way of practicing meditation, where the object of meditation is the mind itself. And so I have benefited greatly from Mahamudra teachings. I'm not sure that they're necessarily, they're very close in some ways to some of the practices that exist in Hinduism, where you're just sort of looking at the object of meditation and asking questions about what is observing. And there are Hindu practices that are similar. And Buddhist practice, and they come up with two different answers about what is, what do you arrive at when you do that deductive practice of understanding the observation. So anyway, that's very in the weeds, but I think Mahamudra is it's life-changing practice. I'm very grateful to have come in contact with it.
All right, if you have any closing thoughts for us to send us away from this beautiful space, I will use Elena Yoder's comments in the chat. She says, she loves the idea of a curious heart, and thank you so much for the beautiful reflections.
Oh,
if you have any closing thoughts for us, we will.
I think I would just ask you to just really spend some time visualizing your mountaintop. Take time. I for many different periods of my life have like literally dropped off and disappeared to some degree. And I'm saying this more as an admonition to myself, as I keep trying to be on sabbatical, and it doesn't really work out that way for me right now. But I think that, you know, even what does it mean to like make mini sabbaticals in your day, to visualize and understand and really take the time to do that in-depth analysis of what is our mountain? What is your mountain? And how are you climbing it? What is your approach? And is it your mountain, right? Or are you climbing somebody else's mountain? And have you decided whether other people's mountains are for them? And where are you really digging into your own journey and what it is that you bring to the work, and what it is, what mountaintop you want to arrive at. And just spend time in reflection and contemplation around that. It's a really, really beneficial practice. It's really benefits me. It's humbling. And it is both humbling and inspiring to be able to take the time to do that. So I wish that kind of time and space for each and every one of you.